Hi, everyone. I'm Josie Schaefer, Director of the Center for Public Affairs Research, and I am here with Dr. Mike Norton of the Reinvestment Fund to talk about housing in Nebraska. Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing well, Josie. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming back. We heard after your session, some folks wanted a little bit more clarification on a few topics and some big picture takeaways. So I have just a couple of questions for you. Shouldn't take long at all.
Great.
So to get started, for those who are new to housing data, so new to using data on the housing industry in Nebraska, where do you recommend they begin looking? So our real beginner basics, how should they start?
A really easy place to visualize and see housing data for Nebraska is on Policy Map. We have a link on the presentation to Policy Map. It makes it all the data that were presented on the presentation are readily accessible and easily visualized and free and open to the public on Policy Map. If you want to actually download data sets that have tables of the data, you should go to either the American Community Survey, the HUD PB&R website, or you can go to the HMDA website that's on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's website. But another really good place to go to download data is to the University of Minnesota's Population Center, which does a very good job of collecting, repackaging, and making these data very easy to access, going back a very long time. So those are three places that you can get all of these data really quick.
Really great. Are links to all of those in your website? Otherwise, we can put some with this presentation too.
The links to Policy Map, to the American Community Survey, to the HMDA website, and to the HUD website are all in my presentation. If you want to give folks a link to the University of Minnesota, you can do that, but like you guys are in the University of Nebraska, so you can make that decision, you know.
Oh, we love to share. No, I think one of the most interesting things that's going on right now in the research field is that so many folks are taking these publicly available data sets and putting them together in easy to find and package and view and accessible. And so I'm really excited about that. We want to make data easy to grab, not hard to grab. So I'm really excited that so many folks are working with these data sets to find great ways to visualize it. Awesome. So you did some research right on Nebraska data. You kind of dug deep into what's going on in Nebraska. Just some big general bullet points about how you would characterize housing in Nebraska.
Well, when you look at the state of Nebraska and you look across all the counties in Nebraska, it's very clear that Nebraska is predominantly a single family, largely owner occupied, and pretty old housing stock by national standards. Old is not necessarily bad. Old can be very well made. And so long as it's maintained properly, it can last a very, very long time. But old also suggests that in places where that's not happening, there is potential for disrepair, blight, and persistent deferred maintenance. And that's going to vary by county and place. Housing is relatively affordable in Nebraska, and that comes across very clearly for homeowners. But renters, on the other hand, like renters across the country, consistently experience affordability challenges across the state. And those consistent almost across every county in Nebraska, as you had a pretty substantial share of the renter population who are spending more than a third of their monthly income on housing. And it's important to recognize, too, in Nebraska, you know, that a substantial portion of the overall real estate activity in the state is not residential, right? It's primarily agricultural. Right? And that sort of creates different ways of thinking about how residential real estate fits into the broader state mix.
Really good point. And I think those are all things, right, we experience here in Nebraska: older housing stock, higher costs for renters, and even I would say we know comparatively affordable. But yeah, in Nebraska, it has definitely been tightening up. And I think all of those factors really sort of work together to make us start to feel that change in affordability. What are some trends to watch for based on your snapshot of Nebraska housing composition and affordability? Where do you think we're going?
When we look at cities and states where we do work across the country, if we were to be working in Nebraska, the biggest thing to probably pay attention to from an equity standpoint is the persistent gaps in affordable rental options for Nebraskans. Right? It's such a heavily single-family owner-occupied dominated state that there's clearly a lack of available rental options for those who want it or those who need it. And the fact that there's not enough rental capacity, right? There's not enough units, right? So putting a lot of pressure on the rents going up, right? Which is going to drive the affordability challenges that we saw in all of those places, right? So until rental affordability sort of comes down, and that's only going to happen if you build more affordable units, you're going to consistently see that folks who can't afford or don't want to purchase a home in Nebraska are going to be challenged to meet the other basic needs that they have in their lives because they're going to be spending a disproportionate share of their incomes on the rent.
Absolutely. And I'm excited. There are a lot of initiatives going on around that in Nebraska, but it takes time. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of families right now. What are some trends to watch for based on your snapshot of statewide residential mortgage activity? So we covered renters. How about our homeowners?
So the residential real estate market in Nebraska, particularly for homeowners, was really steady even during the pandemic. Rather with pretty modest growth, right, in home purchasing over the past 4 years. That in contrast to sort of explosive growth that you've seen in other parts of the country. What you did see in Nebraska is this really substantial explosion of refinance activity over the last couple of years. And that is actually a good thing for the economy because it puts more money back into people's pockets. It gets them into a more affordable mortgage situation. And conceivably, they're able to spend their money on other things around the economy and not sinking it all into housing. I would expect over the next couple of years, those refinance activity is going to come way down, right? Because interest rates are going up and there aren't going to be as many people for whom refinancing makes sense because everybody's going to be in low interest rate mortgages at this point. And if you could, you probably did. On the other side, I wouldn't expect that the home purchase market's really going to decline or take a big hit in the way that you'll see it in other places that really boomed. Right, so it's not going to have the up and down that, say, a place like Boise, Idaho is going to have, because it was so steady to begin with. There's still plenty of demand out there, and it really is generally affordable across the board. And so I think in that sense, from a home ownership standpoint and from a home purchase standpoint, Nebraskans should be, generally optimistic about the stability of their housing market.
That's what we're known for. We keep it stable. Absolutely. Yeah. In all sorts of indicators, we tend to not have the huge spikes. We up and down like everyone does. But that's really good to hear. Although, again, out on the street in Nebraska, for a while there, it did seem like everyone was buying a house. Maybe they were just refining. Who is most likely to use this data? Who do you suggest go and access your presentation and some of the data you pulled and put together for us? How can it be helpful, especially in the policy environment here in Nebraska?
Well, typically the folks who are using data like this and these data sources are typically used by state municipal governments in the development of housing plans for their cities or for their states. Cities that have to do annual sort of housing, or every 5 years are doing a housing needs assessment for their community development block grant allocations. They will use these data to identify gaps in housing for different types of populations at different price points. And these data are very good for that sort of thing. They're also used by attorney general offices that are conducting investigations for fair housing violations in the mortgage market. And in fact, just recently, the Pennsylvania Attorney General announced a settlement with Omaha-based Trident Mortgage for redlining practices in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And Trident will now be investing $20 million over the next 5 years into supporting affordable housing and low-income people's access to mortgage products in the eastern part of the country. And so there are a number of both sort of planning and enforcement mechanisms that government will use to these data for, both from a planning standpoint and thinking about how to allocate their scarce resources, but then also to understand whether or not the financial institutions in their communities are meeting the obligations that they have to the public.
Absolutely. And here in 2022, we're talking about redlining. It's still going on and in all sorts of ways. I actually have a good friend at Rice University who just wrote a book mostly focusing on appraisals, right? And certain communities are deflated by the appraisers, and it is essentially creating redlining and community disinvestment. It's kind of wild. Really interesting. Just throwing this one out just because I do know you talked a little bit about equity in and mortgages in particular. Any other trends you saw there?
The disparities in access to mortgage credit in Omaha between white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian borrowers are consistent with the kinds of disparities we see in cities across the country, but they're not as severe. Part of that is probably because the Hispanic and Black populations in Omaha aren't as big. You did see very wide disparities for Native Americans, right? So their ability to access mortgage credit is pretty substantially impaired in Omaha, and that happens for a variety of reasons that are challenges that other populations just don't have. And so I would say that, you know, the kinds of disparities that you see, in access to mortgage credit, elevated denial rates among comparable buyers who are comparably qualified for mortgage lending, where you're going to have white borrowers with lower denial rates than Black borrowers and Hispanic borrowers. And every place that happens, it's worth looking a little bit more closely to see why that's happening. Right.
I think that's a really fair point. And again, a kind of a Nebraska normal for us, but right, it does show up and still something to look at. And another really interesting use of housing data, right? Not just in thinking about housing and building housing and financing housing, but how housing is such a big part of how we live our lives. And so when we are discriminated against in other areas like housing, also a problem and can create significant challenges for quality of life more broadly too. So I thought that was particularly interesting in your slides. Thanks for sharing. Mike, thank you so much for coming back and having this quick conversation with me about your work on housing in Nebraska. I plugged you as now a Nebraskan, so we welcome you. We're so glad you're here. I'm so glad you reached out and we were able to work together on this. Looking forward to doing more in the future.
Thank you for having me, Josie. It's been my pleasure, and I really love Nebraska.
We love to hear that. Go tell everyone. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much.